There is a two-word phrase that you constantly repeat, turning it into the most powerful curse or blessing of your life. I am. When Moses asked for God's name, the answer was, I am that I am. A revelation that your consciousness is the creative power in action. Goddard decoded what the translations deliberately obscured. Every time you declare, I am anxious, or I am inadequate, you're using the same power that sustains galaxies to sculpt limitation. Abdullah, the Ethiopian mystic who trained Goddard, demonstrated the reversal. He made Goddard fall asleep in New York while sensorially experiencing being in Barbados. No outer action, just an imaginative occupation of the desired state. Within 3 weeks, the first-class transatlantic passage materialized through an unexpected letter. The same mechanism that created every painful, repetitive pattern in your life can manifest any reality when operated consciously. You have been invoking situations and circumstances against yourself, but you should be invoking them in your favor.
There is a phrase that you repeat dozens of times per day, two seemingly harmless words that precede your most casual statements. You pronounce them without realizing that you're invoking the most feared and revered power of all sacred scriptures. And every time you use them, the entire universe reorganizes itself to make real what comes after them. These two words are, I am. Neville Goddard spent 3 decades decoding ancient manuscripts in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. What he discovered was systematically hidden by religious institutions for 2,000 years, not through ignorance, by design. Because when you understand what it really means when you say I am, the entire religious power structure collapses. There is no more need for intermediaries between you and the divine. There are no more supplications directed to the heavens. There are no more external saviors. The clue was always visible, hidden in plain sight in the most important passage of the Old Testament. When Moses encountered the burning bush on Mount Horeb and asked for the name of the one who spoke, the answer echoed through the centuries, I am that I am. And then the instruction, you shall say to the children of Israel, I am has sent me to you. But notice the subtle manipulation that happened. Later translations transformed this present and living I am into He is, distant, separate, unreachable. Temples were erected to worship this He out there. Priestly hierarchies established themselves as mediators between you and this He on high. And humanity forgot that the I am is not a being observing from afar. It is the very consciousness through which you are processing these words right now. Goddard was not alone in this discovery. The Dead Sea Scrolls, suppressed for decades after their discovery, contained Gnostic texts that affirmed the same truth. Sufi mystics risked execution for declaring, I am the absolute truth. Meister Eckhart was nearly burned by the Inquisition for teaching that the I with which we see God is the same I with which God sees us. All pointed to the same dangerous secret. The consciousness that allows you to know that you exist is not an attribute that you possess. It is literally what you are. And here begins the real terror, or liberation, depending on your perspective. If the I am that you experience is the operating power of God, then every statement you make after those two words carries creative force. I am inadequate is not just a negative thought. It is a divine decree being implemented by the power that sustains galaxies. I am sick is not an observation. It is an instruction being executed by the intelligence that coordinates trillions of cellular processes in your body at this instant. The ancients knew this. That's why the name of God was unpronounceable in the Temple of Jerusalem, not out of abstract reverence, but out of knowledge of the catastrophic power of incorrectly using the name I am. They understood that to pronounce I am, followed by any qualification, was to invoke the primordial creative power to manifest exactly that condition. You have been doing this your entire life without knowing it. That chronic anxiety that you developed, you created it through thousands of declarations of, "I am anxious." Those recurring financial problems, you perpetuate them every time you affirm, "I am broke." That persistent loneliness, you materialize it with every "I am alone," not as punishment, not as karma, as law, as impersonal and reliable as gravity. Goddard discovered this in the most brutal way. The son of a poor family in Barbados, he unconsciously used the power of I am to create limitation after limitation. It was only when he met an Ethiopian mentor who knew the Kabbalistic secrets that he understood. All human suffering results from the ignorant use of God's name, and all liberation comes from learning to use it consciously. The evidence is everywhere once you know where to look. Why do positive affirmations sometimes work and sometimes not? Why do some people manifest with ease while others struggle? The answer is not in the technique. It is in the degree of identification with the assumed state. When you truly feel and know I am followed by the desired condition, when it becomes your assumed identity and not just repeated words, the universe has no choice but to conform. There is a silent instant every morning that reveals who you really are. It happens in the interval between deep sleep and complete awakening. In that fraction of a second, before you remember your name, your age, your problems, and your bills, you simply are. You are pure consciousness experiencing existence. Goddard insisted that this moment is the most direct access to your divine nature, before the ego built by habits and memories reassumes control. Modern science describes this instant as the natural passage between sleeping and waking, that brief band where we haven't yet resumed our roles, stories, and worries. Long before we had names for it, mystics already recognized it as a portal. In it, universal consciousness has not yet been filtered through human personality. It is when the I am exists without qualifications, and it is exactly this naked and simple I am that the scriptures point to as God. The conversation between Moses and the burning bush doesn't need to be read as a historical episode in Sinai, but as an internal map of awakening. Moses represents the mind that questions its own origin. The bush that burns without being consumed symbolizes consciousness that observes without being affected. When this mind asks, "What is your name?" the answer doesn't come from outside, but from within. I am that I am. It's not the description of a fixed, distant, and separate being, but the revelation of a continuous state of existing, being in act. God is not something outside of you. It is the very existing happening now through you. Over time, many institutions erected a narrative of separation. They said that you were born in sin, are stained, corrupted, unworthy, that you need external salvation, mediators, purification rituals. This reading inverts the direction of the teaching. You didn't fall from divine grace. You are divine grace experiencing temporary limitation. There is no real abyss between you and God. There is the game of consciousness pretending to be separate so it can discover the joy of reunion. Every authentic mystical tradition, before crystallizing into dogma, taught the same thing. The Upanishads affirm that absolute consciousness and individual consciousness are one reality seen from different angles. Zen points to the original face before your parents were born, that is, your identity beyond form. The Kabbalah describes each soul as a spark of the infinite flame, not separate from it, but an expression of it. Notice, however, how you use this power dozens of times a day. I am tired. The principle that moves the stars in orbit wears the form of fatigue. I am confused. The intelligence that coordinates entire ecosystems assumes the costume of doubt. I am a victim. The author of all experience plays the role of the powerless. Each time, you employ the most sacred name, I am, to mold limitation. For Goddard, the plagues of Egypt, the miracles of Christ, the prophetic visions, none of this needed to have happened as a historical account. They are psychological descriptions of what occurs when the I am consciousness operates in different states. When Moses transforms water into blood, we see consciousness energizing common experience, water into vitality blood. When Jesus walks on water, we see the mind mastering emotional storms, sea. When Elijah ascends in a chariot of fire, we see consciousness rising above material limitations. The problem was never a lack of power. The same power that ignited the universe is activated every time you pronounce I am. What exists is conditioning. Since childhood, we were trained to add limits to these sacred words. Parents, teachers, society, all, without realizing it, taught us to reduce the unlimited to narrow labels and self-declarations that deny our nature. Think about the last time something went wrong. What was the immediate reflex? I am so stupid. I am unlucky. I am always the last to be chosen. Each phrase was not mere complaint. It was an instruction launched into the field of experience. And reality, which doesn't judge or argue, only mirrors, reorganizing circumstances to confirm the definition that you yourself decreed. The evidence is in your own observation. People you know who seem to magnetize results. Notice how they speak about themselves and which qualities they connect to I am. People stuck in cycles of failure. Listen to their repeated declarations. The difference is rarely luck, karma, or divine favoritism. The difference, almost always, is the use of the name. Some apply it to expand, others to contract, both exercising the same power, often without realizing it. None of this requires tense effort, forced affirmations, or denial of reality. It requires attention. In the instant you awaken, in that silent interval where you haven't yet resumed your stories, recognize I am. Remain a moment in that being without adjectives. Then, consciously choose the qualifiers that serve the life you wish to embody. I am clear. I am capable. I am loved. I am creative. I am free. Throughout the day, when you notice a narrow label arising, interrupt it gently and redirect the name to a quality that reflects your true nature. This is how ancient symbols gain body in daily life. The common water of habit becomes living blood of purpose. The agitated sea of emotions is crossed with firmness. The chariot of fire of inspiration elevates your perspective. You are not trying to reach God. You are allowing the very existing, the I am, to express itself with less interference. And little by little, external life begins to accompany the internal definition that you sustain with constancy. In the end, everything returns to that morning gap. Before the name, the age, the debts, and the schedule, there exists a simple being. If you learn to recognize this starting point and to qualify the I am with consciousness, you will see the world respond with the same precision with which it has always responded, only now in favor of expansion. Not because someone out there granted permission, but because the source of experience was always there, where you are, silently saying, I am. The most transformative revelation of Goddard emerged after decades of decoding sacred texts in their original languages. He discovered that Christ, far from being just a historical figure, represents something much deeper and more immediate, the imaginative power operating in every human being. This was not a new theory. Mystics through the centuries reached the same conclusion, but were silenced, marginalized, or misunderstood. The word Christ derives from the Greek Christos, meaning the anointed one or the activated one. In the original manuscripts, it doesn't appear as a proper name, but as a state of consciousness. Paul of Tarsus was explicit in his epistles. Christ in you, the hope of glory. Not Christ distant in the heavens, not Christ intermediating from the exterior. Christ in you, present, active, operating through the faculty we call imagination. Origen of Alexandria, one of the most respected theologians of early Christianity, taught that the scriptures must be understood on 3 simultaneous levels. The literal offers historical narrative for those who need a concrete structure. The moral provides ethical guidance for daily conduct. But the spiritual level, which he considered the true one, reveals that all biblical events describe internal psychological processes. Each miracle is a demonstration of what happens when consciousness operates in certain states. Consider the transformation of water into wine at Cana through this interpretive lens. Goddard proposed that water represents the ordinary state of consciousness, without distinctive flavor, common, everyday. Wine symbolizes the elevated state of consciousness, rich, intoxicating, transformative. When Mary says, "They have no wine," it represents the internal recognition that something essential is missing. Jesus' initial response, "My hour has not yet come," reflects the imagination's resistance when physical time seems inadequate. But through persistence and action, based on the assumption that the transformation has already occurred, the miracle manifests. This interpretation gains credibility when we examine Goddard's own experience. He reported in several documented lectures his learning with Abdullah, an Ethiopian rabbi versed in Jewish mysticism. When Goddard wished to travel to Barbados but had no resources, Abdullah instructed him with disconcerting firmness, "You are already in Barbados." Faced with Goddard's protests about physical reality, Abdullah explained the principle: to live imaginatively from the point of view of the realized desire, not toward it. The technique was specific. Each night, when lying down in his New York apartment, Goddard should fall asleep sensorially experiencing being in Barbados, not visualizing a future trip, but imaginatively inhabiting the destination, feeling the familiar texture of Barbadian sheets, hearing the specific nighttime sounds of the island, breathing the tropical air laden with salt. After 3 weeks of this practice, without any exterior effort, an unexpected letter arrived offering a completely paid passage. This is not an isolated incident, but a demonstration of a principle that Goddard argued was universal. The same dynamic that makes obsessive worry materialize, exactly what is feared, operates when directed consciously. The difference is only in the consciousness and direction of the process. How many times have we mentally rehearsed confrontations until they occur as imagined? How many times has our anticipatory anxiety created the conditions we feared? The multiplication of loaves and fishes, according to Goddard's Decoding, illustrates another aspect of this law. The 5 loaves would represent the 5 senses under imaginative command. The 2 fish would symbolize the transcendence of perceptual duality. The 5,000 fed would demonstrate how imagination, when it assumes complete control of sensory experience, can expand apparently limited resources. The 12 baskets of leftovers would indicate the abundance that remains after the demonstration of imaginative mastery. The episode of Lazarus offers perhaps the most powerful instruction. Dead for 4 days, enough time for irreversible decomposition to begin, Lazarus represents any situation that seems absolutely irrecoverable. Jesus weeps before the tomb, and Goddard interpreted this weeping as the lament of human imagination when it temporarily accepts limitation as definitive. But then comes the demonstration of authority. Lazarus, come forth. Not as a hopeful plea, but as an imaginative command that admits no other possibility. What Goddard proposed was not the abandonment of reason or the denial of physical reality. It was the recognition that imagination, when operated with sustained sensory conviction, possesses causal primacy over external circumstances. quantum physicists have discovered that observation collapses probability into actuality. Goddard argued that the most powerful observation is the imaginative one. When maintained with persistence, it directs the probabilistic collapse. The resurrection, in this interpretive framework, is not a unique historical event or future promise. It is what occurs whenever imagination refuses to accept the evidence of the senses as a final verdict. When diagnoses seem definitive, when situations seem irreversible, when everyone agrees on the impossibility, in these moments, Goddard argued, the inner Christ can decree a new reality. Not through vague hope or superficial positive thinking, but through total and sustained imaginative occupation of the state where limitation has been transcended. The prayer that Goddard rediscovered has no relation whatsoever to the repetitive supplications taught in religious institutions. For centuries, millions have knelt murmuring requests to a God who apparently ignored them most of the time. They prayed rosaries, repeated mantras, fasted, and made promises, hoping to attract divine attention through sacrifice or insistence. But the original texts, when read without the doctrinal veil, reveal a completely different method, one that works with mathematical consistency because it operates through law, not through arbitrary favor. When Jesus said, "When you pray, enter your room and close the door," he wasn't prescribing physical isolation. The room is your consciousness. The closed door is the withdrawal of attention from the sensory world. And the Father who sees in secret is the I Am operating below the threshold of conscious perception. True prayer happens in this liminal state between waking and sleeping, when the inner critic silences and imagination assumes total control. Goddard discovered this through methodical experimentation, not through blind faith. The state he identified as ideal for subconscious impression corresponds to what neuroscientists today call the hypnagogic state, those moments before falling asleep when brainwaves slow from beta to alpha and then to theta. In this state, the barrier between conscious and subconscious dissolves. The analytical mind that insists this is impossible is offline. Imagination can operate without resistance. The specific process that Goddard taught contradicts all conventional advice about manifestation. There is no gratitude list, there is no vision board, there is no repetition of affirmations. Instead, there is meticulous construction of a simple scene that would imply that the desire has already been realized. Note the crucial distinction. Not a scene of the desire being realized, but one that could only exist after realization. If someone seeks professional promotion, they don't visualize receiving the news or signing the contract. They construct a later scene, perhaps a friend shaking their hand saying, "I always knew you'd get that position." If seeking a relationship, they don't imagine meeting someone or the first date. They experience an everyday scene that would imply an established relationship, perhaps seeing 2 toothbrushes in the bathroom in the morning. The construction of the scene requires surgical precision. It must be short, no more than a few seconds. It must involve action, not passive observation. It must include specific sensory elements that make it unmistakably real. The handshake is not generic. It has specific temperature, pressure, and texture. The words of congratulation are not vague. They have the particular tone, timbre, and cadence of the imagined person speaking. Every sensory detail anchors the experience in reality, even though this reality is still purely imaginative. But here arises the element that separates those who manifest from those who merely daydream, the ability to completely let go after the impression. Letting go doesn't mean forgetting or not caring. It means trusting that the moment the scene was experienced with sensory reality in the appropriate state, something irreversible happened behind the scenes of consciousness. Seeds were planted in dimensions that the senses cannot access. Patterns were established in what physicists call the quantum field of probability. Goddard was emphatic about what happens after a successful impression. Forces begin to move in ways that seem impossible to predict. People you've never met are compelled to take actions that facilitate your desire. Seemingly unrelated circumstances converge. Fortuitous accidents occur. But none of this is an accident. It is the logical unfolding of the seed planted in imagination, finding its way to express itself in the physical world. The fatal mistake that most make is trying to figure out the how. How will the money come? Through which person? By what sequence of events? But questioning the how is admitting that the imaginative impression was incomplete. If you truly experience the reality of the fulfilled desire, you wouldn't be questioning the process. You would be resting in the certainty of consummation. It's like planting a seed and then digging it up daily to check if it's growing. The very checking destroys the process that was occurring naturally. Abdullah demonstrated this with instructive brutality. When Goddard returned anxiously after his first attempts, asking when Barbados would happen, Abdullah replied, "You are already in Barbados. There is no when." When Goddard pointed to the contradictory physical reality, Abdullah refused to discuss. If you are not in Barbados, you haven't done the work. If you are, there's nothing to discuss. This apparent rigidity hid profound wisdom. The moment you question whether it worked is the moment you abandon the state. It's like being in Sao Paulo and asking when you'll arrive in Sao Paulo. The very question reveals that, psychologically, you've left the destination and returned to the starting point, and in that return, you cancel the instruction given to the creative power. The evidence that this method works is not in inspiring testimonials or exceptional cases. It is in your own experience with its perverse inverse. Every time you lay down replaying a feared confrontation, rehearsing every word, feeling the adrenaline, experiencing the humiliation in advance, and then watching horrified as the situation unfolded exactly as rehearsed. You know the power of pre-sleep imagination. You've just been using it to create what you fear instead of what you desire. The question that few have the courage to face is this: if you really are the I Am operating through human form, why would you choose to experience limitation, suffering, and confusion? Goddard offered an answer that challenges both existential pessimism and superficial spiritual optimism. You didn't fall into this world, you deliberately dove in, and there was a reason that only makes sense when understood from the point of view of infinite consciousness. Imagine for a moment being omnipotent, not as a power fantasy, but as operational reality. You can create anything instantly. There is no resistance, obstacle, or challenge. Now realize the problem. Without resistance, there can be no overcoming. Without darkness, light has no meaning. Without limitation, power is just untested potential. Infinite consciousness, paradoxically, cannot fully know itself without experiencing its opposite. Goddard discovered in Hermetic and Kabbalistic texts the same narrative. Divine consciousness deliberately fragments itself, forgets itself, limits itself to add to the totality of experiences that can only be obtained through the journey of return. It's not a fall, it's a courageous dive. It's not exile, it's necessary exploration. Each human soul is God playing the cosmic game of forgetting in order to experience remembering. The scriptures encoded this in the declaration. You are classified in heaven as you are on earth, for this is only a copy. The physical world is not a fundamental reality. It is a three-dimensional projection of multi-dimensional consciousness patterns. Each achievement here reflects a change of internal state. Each failure reveals where consciousness still operates in limitation. The external world is literally the progress report of your awakening journey. But complete awakening doesn't require physical death. Goddard was emphatic about this, contradicting centuries of religious doctrine that promises reward only in the afterlife. Awakening happens when, still in the body, you fully recognize your divine nature and begin to operate consciously as I am. At that moment, the game changes completely. You continue playing, but now you know the rules. You continue experiencing, but now as a conscious creator, not an unconscious victim. And here arises the crushing weight of responsibility. If your I am consciousness is the only operating power in your experience, then every circumstance in your life, without exception, is your creation. That tyrannical boss is not a test sent by an external God. It is the manifestation of the concept you hold about authority. That partner who betrayed you is not karma from past lives. It is the materialized expression of your beliefs about trust and intimacy. That persistent illness is not genetic bad luck. It is your body conforming to deeply held concepts about yourself. This is not superficial blaming or toxic positive thinking. It is recognition of the operational mechanics of consciousness. Every person in your life is playing the role you assign to them in your imagination. Change the imaginative role, change the person, not because you control them like a puppet, but because you change the state of consciousness from which your experience of them emerges. Goddard reported an experiment he conducted to test this. There was a particularly difficult co-worker who made his days miserable. Instead of confronting or avoiding him, Goddard spent a week, each night before sleep, imaginatively revising every interaction of the day. But in the revision, the colleague was kind, helpful, and even friendly. Hostile conversations were rewritten as cordial. Confrontations were transformed into cooperation. After a week of this practice, without any conversation or exterior change, the colleague began to act exactly as Goddard had imagined. Not approximately, exactly. The same principle operates on a larger scale. Those repetitive patterns in your life, the specific type of betrayal you encounter in different relationships, the same financial problem that arises regardless of job, the same family dynamic recreated with different people. All are you encountering your own crystallized concept projected through different actors. The faces change, the names change, the circumstances change, but the pattern remains because the state of consciousness that creates it remains. The golden rule gains completely new meaning in this context. Do unto others as you would have them do unto you is not moral advice to gain heavenly reward. It is a technical instruction about how consciousness operates. When you hold negative concepts about others, you're not harming them. You're programming your own future experience. When you envy others' success, you're instructing your consciousness to experience lack. When you genuinely celebrate another's prosperity, you're affirming that prosperity exists in your world of experience. Goddard frequently mentioned Ezekiel's text about the elders of Israel drawing abominable images on the walls of dark caves, thinking God didn't see. But God sees through their own eyes. This is not a metaphor about divine omniscience watching from heaven. It is a literal description of how you, as incarnated I am, are constantly creating through your imagination, especially the fantasies you think are private. That mental conversation you have in the shower, verbally destroying someone who irritated you. You're programming future confrontation. That elaborate revenge fantasy you cultivate before sleep. You're planting seeds that will germinate as conflict. That obsessive worry about financial failure that you mentally replay. You're writing the script that reality will follow. There is no private thought because there is no separation between the thinker and the creator. The modern world offers disturbing evidence of this on a collective scale. Billions are watching the same fear narratives in the media. Billions are imagining the same disasters, conflicts, and collapses, and then expressing surprise when exactly these scenarios materialize. Goddard argued that there is no prophecy, there is only collective imagination creating what was intensely visualized. Wars don't happen because they were predicted. They were predicted because they were imagined with such collective intensity that their manifestation became inevitable. But the inverse is also true. Every time you firmly hold the vision of someone in their best potential, even when they show their worst, you're offering them an alternative state to occupy. Not through manipulation or control, but through offering a higher concept in the shared field of consciousness. This is why some presences are naturally healing, not through special power, but through refusal to accept limitation as definitive in others. The choice before you is not whether you will create. You are creating constantly at every moment with every sustained assumption. The choice is whether you will continue creating unconsciously, a victim of your own habitual thought patterns, or whether you will assume total responsibility as the I am that you have always been, only temporarily forgotten. The ultimate test is not understanding these revelations. It's what happens tomorrow at 7 in the morning when the alarm clock rings. At that moment, will you return to the same mental patterns that sculpted your current reality? Or will you begin the discipline of operating consciously as the I am that you have always been? Goddard warned that knowledge without application is not just useless, it's dangerous, because now you no longer have the excuse of ignorance. Religious institutions survived for millennia, keeping this knowledge veiled because they knew a humanity conscious of its divine power cannot be controlled through fear of hell or promise of paradise. Mystics were executed for revealing these truths, texts were burned, sects were persecuted, and teachings were distorted. And now, through Goddard, the veil has been completely removed. The I am consciousness that processes these words is the operating power of God. Your imagination is the Christ of the Gospels. Every circumstance in your life is the materialization of states you have assumed and held. The temptation will be to file this knowledge along with other interesting spiritual concepts that you collect but never apply. Or even more tragic, to use this revelation for intellectual sophistication while continuing to declare the same limitations using the sacred name. I am realistic, code for commitment to limitation. I am skeptical, using divine power to doubt divine power itself. I am only human. The supreme blasphemy disguised as humility. Goddard didn't demand faith, he demanded experimentation. Choose something verifiable, he instructed, not total transformation or instant enlightenment, something specific, personal, measurable. Construct the scene implying realization, precise sensory detail. Enter the borderline state between waking and sleeping. Experience it until the scene eclipses the physical room, then let go completely. Live from the psychological state of possession, not seeking, and document what happens. The subsequent events will defy all conventional logic of cause and effect. People you've never met will make decisions that facilitate your desire. Mathematically, improbable circumstances will converge. Necessary information will appear through routes impossible to predict. When this occurs, and it will occur if you maintain the state, you will face the ultimate psychological crossroads, recognize your imaginative authorship, or invent explanations that preserve the illusion of not being the creator. Most will choose the illusion. Being a victim of circumstances offers perverse comfort. You can blame others, the system, genetics, destiny. As a creator, every failure confesses that you imagined failure more vividly than success. Every recurring problem exposes unexamined mental states. Every difficult person reveals crystallized concepts that you project. Total responsibility is a weight that few can bear to carry. For those who accept this weight, the compensations transcend any external reward. Not prizes or recognition, but the unshakable freedom of knowing. No circumstance is a final sentence. No limitation is an absolute law. No external power governs your experience except through your imaginative acceptance. The practical protocol disturbs with its simplicity. Monitor your I am declarations for 24 hours. Just observe, without judgment. How many times do you invoke the divine name to decree inadequacy? Then begin the discipline. Not artificial affirmations that provoke mental resistance. Simply pause before completing I am with limitation. Reformulate. I am terrible with technology becomes I'm developing new skills. Subtle change, but you've ceased using creative force against yourself. In the pre-sleep state, exercise the power of revision. The conversation that failed, reimagine it with success. The moment of humiliation, rewrite it as triumph. This is not denial. It's planting seeds for future harvest. The imaginatively revised past becomes a template for the coming manifestation. When the rational mind screams that this is fantasy, and it will scream, it was programmed to defend limitation, remember every time you created exactly what you feared through obsessive worry. You know intimately the power of imagination. The only change is conscious direction replacing automatic drift. Goddard identified only 2 modes of failure in this method. First, abandonment. You give up the assumed state, returning to the familiar. Second, contamination. You simultaneously maintain visions of success and failure, creating mutual cancellation, but persisting in the desired state, living from it instead of toward it, maintaining it despite contradictory sensory evidence, failure becomes impossible. Not unlikely, impossible. You operate the same law that keeps galaxies in rotation. The universe awaits your next I am instruction. But here's the final challenge. Consciously accessing this state of creative power requires discipline that the modern agitated mind resists. The constant mental noise, the thousands of contradictory inner voices, the programming of decades. All this creates static that blocks your connection with pure I am. Goddard emphasized that the meditative state is not spiritual luxury. It's a technical necessity for operating as a conscious creator. It's in this mental silence that you touch divine consciousness without interference from the constructed ego. It's in this quietude that imaginative instructions imprint on the fabric of reality without distortion. All change begins with understanding your role as co-creator, and the only way to connect with this divine intelligence is through meditation. We have developed a set of audio tools to help you access this higher state of consciousness. To learn more and get immediate access, click the link on the screen or in the comments. If this video resonated with you, write in the comments. It made sense to me.